everybody, welcome back to Bentley House. Today I am working on another prompt video. I know, it's been a while. This is going to be prompt number 13. Lucky number 13. This video is in collaboration with Ash from Ashen Walls. I will make sure to put a link to her video and to her channel in the description box below. I highly suggest checking out her Kitty Hensley playlist for a project that's built completely from scratch. Ash chose the prompt for today, which is going to be snails. So let's get started. First, of course, I'm going to need my handy dandy prompt notebook, and I'm going to be looking for the prompt snails. I will leave a list of all the prompts in the description box below if you wanted to make your own prompt list or work on some of the prompts that we've already worked on my channel. As soon as I heard the prompt snails, I immediately thought of this little glass dome. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Penelope, but there's a scene in her room where she has all these glass domes with all these amazing tiny worlds within them, and I've always thought that was so fascinating. I've also always had this little clock sitting inside the dome, and I thought it would be really cool to make some kind of snail world inside the dome surrounding this small clock. It's actually a pencil sharpener, but I was really attracted to the kind of clock face. It looks like an antique clock face. I always like to sketch out my idea first. It wasn't super necessary in this case because I already knew what I wanted to do, but it's time to go ahead and get started on the base. I'm going to begin by creating a circle out of mat board that fits perfectly on this base, because if I do want to take it out of the dome in the future and reuse the dome, then it's a little bit easier to do so. Now I'm going to be using some foam board to build up a rock type formation. The clock isn't up quite high enough, so I thought this would be the easiest way to lift it up just a little bit. I'm cutting off some edges, trying not to make it too pointy, but pointy enough to look like a rock. And then I'm going to rip the top part of the foam board off, revealing just the foam underneath. I'm going to trace the larger shape that I just created onto some foam board so I can make one more rock. I guess it's like a rock step or a rock plateau because it's very flat. I want to make sure that it's big enough for my clock to sit on, but small enough to sit on the previous piece that I made. I'm just basically building up a little platform. After I have those pieces the size that I like, I'm going to take my craft knife and be very careful with it. And I'm going to run it along the sharp edges or the crisp edges of the foam board and create a bevel. This is going to help it give it that stone look. I'm going to do this on both pieces. When I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and glue them on top of each other. I have found that Fabri-Tac glue works really well with gluing foam board together. It works really fast. I would have thought that the acetone inside the glue would have possibly melted the foam, but it doesn't. I'm just putting a 1, 2, 3 block on top of it while it dries so that I know it will dry flat. After that, I'm going to use some matte Mod Podge to cover the entire face of the foam board. Because it's very porous, it becomes hard to paint, and by covering it with Mod Podge, it gives it a more solid surface to get the paint onto. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm pulling out my leftover greenery bag from past projects. I'm pulling out everything I think I might use. I think in this dome there is a danger of putting too much in there, so it's going to be kind of a balance between the clock and the snails and the greenery to make sure that not one part of it takes over the entire dome. After the Mod Podge has dried, I can go ahead and do a layer of gray paint. I found that the Mod Podge on top of the foam board, without doing anything else to it, gave it this really great dimpled effect. It was kind of subtle, but I think it really worked for the top of an old stone, so I like how that came out. I'm now going to be using some coarse ballast. This is by Woodland Scenics. I purchased this, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I still haven't even used half of it. I'm starting out by only putting a few stones here and there to kind of cover up some of the seams between my rocks that I created with foam board. I don't want to add too much because I know later on down the road I'm going to be adding my snails, and I don't want to feel like I took up all the space with the tiny stones. I can always add more later down the road, so for now I'm just starting with a few pieces. Now it's time to add on my pencil sharpener clock. This is a pretty interesting piece that I remember finding at a flea market several years ago. It no longer works. It has a really interesting sound that I enjoy, so I'm going to try and make sure that it can still make that sound, but I think it's supposed to make the little clock pieces at the top turn, or the little bells at the top, and it doesn't do that anymore, so I don't feel like I'm ruining a piece or, you know, taking it out of circulation, this antique piece, because it's already kind of broken. So I'm going to be gluing this down to the top of my foam board stones, and I want to go ahead and age it just a little bit because this is supposed to be an exterior scene. So if any type of clock or anything really has been sitting outside for a while, you will see some signs of age. So I'm just taking a light colored, like a light tan, and I'm just brushing it on the top parts of the clock. I'm using the same concept of starting out with less when it comes to the greenery. I want to go ahead and stick on a few pieces because I think it helps me kind of figure out what it's going to look like in the end, but I don't want to overwhelm the clock with too much greenery, and I don't want to take up too much space to where I don't have enough room for my snails. All I did to glue these down was I just glued the bottom of the stem to the stone, and then any part where it touched the clock, I put a little dab of glue so that it would stick to the clock. I'm going to keep this on my desk while I'm working on my snails so I can keep what scale they need to be in mind. I'm going to be using this polymer clay set from Arteza. They sent it to me a while ago for me to review. It has so many fun colors in it, and I think it would be a great one to use for this project. I'm going through and just picking out some colors that are kind of catching my eye. I'm picking a mixture of neutral tones and bright colors. I want the neutral, more earthy tones to be for the bodies of the snails, and I want the brighter colors to be for the snail shells to kind of stick out against the clock and the greenery of the piece. I ended up just playing around with some of the different neutral tones and mixing them together and just trying to figure out the colors that I wanted. I definitely wanted the snail bodies to be all sorts of different colors, and tried to figure out how best to make their little bodies. Honestly, I just rolled a little short fat snake of clay and then pushed up one side so that it looked like his little head was sticking up, and that's pretty much all I did to make a snail body. Very simple and very easy to make. While I was creating these, I was trying to figure out how many I was going to make, and I figured because they're all going to be around a clock, moving around a clock, that I should make 12 of them. So there were 12 snails for the 12 numbers on the clock. That's when I came up with my title for this piece, which is The Snails of Time. Ooh. I don't really have a story to go along with them, but if you'd like to make up a story for the Snails of Time, make sure to leave it in the comments down below. When I started working on their shells, I first thought I was going to incorporate the bright color with some of the earth tone color that I had used for their bodies. However, I felt like it still wasn't enough of a pop of color to make them stand out from the base. So I ended up liking the technique I made them with. I just kind of twirled it a little bit and then made sure one end was a little bit thinner, and then as I twirled the shell I made sure that the end ended up on top of the swirl, and then I rounded it out a little bit with my fingers. May not be the most perfect technique, but I did end up liking it, except for the color. So I went back and I just took a couple colors that I thought complemented each other that were still bright. I did the same thing where I curled it up, making sure that the very thin little tiny tail gets curled up on the very top. This, I think, gives it a little bit more of a snail shell, that's gonna be hard to say, shape, snail shell shape. And then I just placed it on top of the body. Because the Arteza clay is pretty sticky, I don't feel like I have to use any liquid clay to connect it. It really just sticks together really well. So here is one finished snail. I don't know why I can't say that. I went back and made all 12 of them. I tried to make each shell just a little bit different, and I moved their little heads around so it looked like they were kind of moving and looking in different directions. It was really kind of fun playing around with these little guys. Real snails have these kind of horn looking things, but I think they're actually like feelers so that they can feel around their environment. And I wanted to make sure and create those as well. I think the easiest way to do this is with the thinnest wire that I have in my wire collection. And I'm just going to cut little tiny bits off with some wire cutters, and then I'm going to be using some pliers to stick them into the soft clay. This did deform them just a little bit, and it was it was difficult to do this because they're so very tiny. But all I did was go back and kind of push the wires around until I liked how they looked, and then kind of re-put them into the position that I liked. This is how they were looking after I added all the wires to all 12 snails. At this point, I baked them on this little metal plate, which, by the way, this is a tool that Arteza sent me as well with the clay stuff. It was like a tool package, and it's really one of my favorite tools to use with clay. I baked them on this plate, and they stayed stuck to the plate once they came out of the oven, which at first I wanted to kind of take them off, but it worked out that they were stuck on there because then I was able to work with them without them just rolling around my tabletop and me losing one of them. I used a watered down brown paint to go over them just to dull the brightness just a tiny bit, and I really liked how the water puddled underneath them, and I thought it gave them a really snail type look because, you know, snails are a little bit slimy. Unfortunately, the paint will eventually dry, but I do create this later on using some polyacrylic. Now I'm using some not watered down paint, and I'm painting just the very tippy top of the wire feeler things on top of the snails because I felt like they were a little bit too shiny. It looked like metal, and I really like the little dab of paint on top. I thought that looked really good. Now I'm adding the polyacrylic, and to do this I'm using a very tiny brush, and I'm making sure to also go over where the wire touches the clay because it'll also act as a glue, making sure those wires stay inside the clay. I went over all the bodies and not the shells because I want the bodies to look like the slimy part of the snail. I will add some more polyacrylic underneath the snail once it's attached to my clock. Before adding the snails on, I wanted to do something to the base to kind of bring in the bright colors so they didn't seem so out of place. I'm using just the lightest touch of some bright colors over the numbers of the clock. Because the numbers of the snails was inspired by the 12 numbers on a clock face, I decided to just kind of relate them a little bit more. And again, this is all kind of in my head. I don't know if the viewer of this would kind of put everything together, but I think that's what's fun about art, and especially miniature art, is you can kind of relate things and put things together in your head and see if the viewer kind of comes up with the same relations or even the same story that you come up with. I tried to keep the colors fairly light, and so you did see me dab with my finger a few times to get any excess paint off. And then when you paint acrylic on plastic, it's really easy if you make a mistake to go back with a toothpick and just scratch it off. So any times I messed up, I just kind of scratched the paint off and it was good to go. Now for the fun part I have been waiting for. I'm going to be adding these little snails all over my clock scene that's going inside of the dome. I'm using some Fabri-Tac glue because this does dry clear and it does have a little bit of the shine left to it when it dries, and so if it shows underneath the snail, it will again look a little bit more like some snail sludge, which would occur if these were actual snails. I'm just placing them where I like them, where there's a flat space, trying to spread out the colors, although I realized I added 2 orange shells onto the front, but it's okay. This is just a fun project, and I didn't want to think too much about it. I just wanted to have fun and enjoy the process. I stuck 11 of them onto the clock and the rock base, and then I saved one of them to be a very special snail that will be climbing up the inside of the dome. Now I did make the base removable so I could use the dome again, so this kind of ruins that a little bit, I guess. I mean, I guess I could maybe remove the snail from the inside, but it would be a little bit more work. So this does kind of make this permanently the snail dome. But I like the idea of the snail climbing on the glass dome itself because I think it gives people pause of, wait, are these real snails or are these part of the project? Because one's climbing up the glass. Like, I think, you know, obviously they don't look super real, but I think it just is one of those things that makes people pause and think for a second. Now that all the snails have their permanent spot reserved because they're glued down, I can go back and up the greenery factor all around and just kind of add some fuzz. It's like this greenery fuzz. It's also Woodland Scenics brand. I'm just adding a little bit of tacky glue wherever I want it to sit and then sprinkling it on top. I think this is again going to make the clock look like it's been out in an environment for a while. When working with this stuff, it's always great to have a hand vac nearby because sometimes it doesn't all get glued down. So I run the vacuum over things. I'm trying not to suck up any snails. It also kind of tests that the glue is working well, but I can tell where things aren't glued down and go back and add more glue. I added a lot of the greenery to the base. I think it really helps the rocks stand out. And then I noticed I really needed something underneath the clock because there is that like hole area, and so I have some of this clumpier stuff that's more like bushes, and so I'm going to add a little bit of that around, and it's going to go underneath the clock and then also around the base of some of the plants. Hiding where the plant is glued down to the rock is really going to help because obviously a plant wouldn't grow straight out of a rock. So by adding a plant there, it gives the idea that maybe there's a crack in the rock, maybe there's some reason that these plants are able to grow straight out of a rock base. So I'm just going around adding little bits here and there. I also added some inside of the pencil sharpener hole. You know, I don't know, just because it's there. But I wanted to make sure I left that crank free, that if I did want to change the time or make the crank sound, that I could. Of course, I had to age it just a little bit. I'm using some of the same watered down brown paint that I used on the snails, and I'm just very lightly going over some of the rocks, some of the green fuzz that I glued down, just to give a little bit of change in color. I think this adds to the realism, but I didn't want to do too much because I did like the light brightness of the whole thing. I'm using some polyacrylic again and a very thin brush because I want to make some snail trails that are going around the piece. If you live in an area with snails, I actually have a snail that is on my front porch. I call him the front porch snail, and he just kind of hangs out there. You will know that snails leave behind this kind of silvery looking film that you can find in the morning after they've been all over the place. So I wanted to recreate that on this piece by using a little bit of polyacrylic. It's not going to stand out a ton, but it's one of those things that when you move the piece around or when you turn the dome, it will kind of reflect the light and it'll be kind of a surprise, I think, when you're looking at it. There was really only a few places to do this on the stone, but I did use this underneath all of the snails. I just kind of put little droplets so that it pooled underneath, so it created that effect that I really liked when I used the watered down paint. I also wanted to add a snail trail behind the snail that's going up the glass. This is really hard to see. I will try to show it to you the best that I can on camera, but just another little detail to add some realism and maybe just a little bit of silliness into this project. I let everything dry completely. We don't want a repeat of last week's video. And I will also be hiding some desiccant somewhere in this project, maybe inside of the bushes here and there to keep everything dry inside of the dome. And then I tried my best to polish the dome. But this is a secondhand dome. I did not buy it from a store. It was in somebody else's collection and it's now mine. So it has had a life before it got to me, and it is just a little bit scratched up and it's got some stuff going on with it, but I think I got it as shined up as I can. Here's the final look at the piece. I really like how it turned out. I think it would be a really fun idea as I find these domes, because you can find them at garage sales, estate sales, all over the place, to create more scenes like this and maybe possibly build up a collection of domes that would maybe one day be my version of that Penelope scene where there are all these little individual worlds happening underneath glass domes. If you have a dome, let me know. Let me know if you've built something underneath it, or if you plan to build something now that you've seen my video, and what your plans are. I would love to hear in the comments. Before I wrap up this video, I want to show you some of the past prompts that I've gotten from other miniaturists. If you want to participate in this, all you need to do is tag me with hashtag Bentley House Prompts on Instagram. I used to say that you could put this on Facebook too, but Facebook has gone through a lot of changes. The community tab that's usually on my page is gone, and so I'm afraid that's not a very reliable way to get your prompt photos to me. You can also email them to me, so that's another way if you're not on Instagram. Also, if you did make a prompt for vampire, which was our last prompt, and you don't see it in this video, I'm so sorry. It's getting harder and harder for me to find all the prompts, so if you want to make sure it's in the next one, be sure to email it directly to me. So let's take a look. Thank you so much to everyone who sent a prompt or showed me a prompt on Instagram. This is absolutely one of my favorite parts about doing these prompt videos, is to see what you all create. If you want to start creating with us, you can start from this prompt, or you can go back and start from the first one. Again, I will link that list in the description box below. It has been such a fun journey, and there's 95 prompts and we're only on prompt number 13. So feel free to jump in anytime. So that's all I have for you today. Be sure to check out Ash's video. Again, the link is in the description box below. She also made something based off the prompt snail. Also make sure to check out some of her other amazing videos. She's a very detailed miniature artist who likes to build things from scratch. So if that's what you like to watch, she is going to be the channel to check out. I hope you all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Snails of time. The snails of time. Ooh, 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 ooh. The snails of time. The snails of time. Ooh, ah.